Eddie Hearn has stated in a recent Boxing Social interview that they may, for Anthony Joshua, look to pursue a Filip Hrgovic fight over the Deontay Wilder fight next, especially if the Filip Hrgovic fight happens to be for the vacant IBF Heavyweight Championship. But the reason why I say vacant is Fury and Usyk have their fight signed. We haven't had an announcement or a date yet, but this one is looking a lot more promising than when we've heard stories about it potentially happening in the past, because both parties and their teams are confirming it, right? So it's looking good. Now the problem is, it's a two-way rematch, right? So if Fury will say loses, he can call for a rematch. Likewise can Alexander Usyk, meaning that the undisputed champion won't be undisputed for very long, because the IBF have a mandatory, and they basically said that it will be Filip Hrgovic next under no uncertain terms, no exceptions. So if a rematch is triggered, now what they could do, they could trigger a rematch, but they could wait for however long, maybe a year or so. Probably it might be a deadline, but round about that we'll say. And the winner, Fury or Usyk, could challenge it. Well, if it's Fury, I wouldn't expect him to, because he said several years now, he's been saying that if he ever was IBF champion, he just chucked that title away straight away anyway, because he's had a lot of beef with the IBF since they stripped him when he beat Klitschko back in 2015. For quite a similar reason, actually, because there was a rematch clause in the Klitschko fight, or for the Klitschko fight, so Fury had to fight him again, which meant that it meant that he couldn't fight his mandatory, which was Vyacheslav Glasov. That would have been a foregone conclusion for either Fury or Klitschko to beat, because that guy was not particularly good. Well, he was alright, but he was a very small, he was extremely small for a heavyweight, very small, no punching power, didn't really have anything. And he ended up fighting Charles Martin. We all know what happened there. He's not fought since then, actually. He blew his knee out. So, long and short of it, I expect the IBF title to be vacant, okay? Which would mean that potentially Joshua could fight for the vacant title. Now, it depends what you... Joshua said since this comeback that he's looking for money. Right? That's what he says, he's fighting for money. He wants to make big fights, big money fights. The Deontay Wilder fight is a bigger fight financially, and it's a bigger fight commercially than the Filip Hrgovic fight. But is there... Eddie Hearn may be saying, obviously he wants Joshua to fight for a world title again, and, you know, we'll talk more about this now in a sec, but going for the world title route against Hrgovic would mean less money. Is it a bigger risk? That's a good question, because I think that AJ loses to Wilder. Now, Hrgovic, boy, you know, I was high on Hrgovic, as you'll know, probably up until 2020. 2021 he wasn't fighting the best opposition. He was looking a bit lackluster, but he was getting them out of there. He wasn't looking the best, but you kind of turn around and say, well, look, he's in there with, you know, who the hell is this guy? So what do you really expect? But then he goes and fights Zhilei Zhang, and that win has aged quite well, albeit a lot of people feel as though he should have lost that fight. It's aged quite well, seeing what Zhilei Zhang has gone on to do. He looked bad in that fight, he did. He looked disinterested, he just didn't look at the races, and, you know, he had stuff going on outside the ring, which you could say that was a contributing factor, no doubt. But fast forward a year later, he's in with Dempsey McKeon, who is a much, much inferior fighter to Zhilei Zhang, much inferior, and anyone can see that. And not only did he labour in that fight, but he actually looked worse, believe it or not, against Dempsey McKeon, who is, as I said, a lesser fighter, much lesser fighter than Zhilei Zhang. He actually looked worse in that fight, even more disinterested. That Hrgovic, honestly, like at world level, he ain't going to do anything if that's how he's looking. Literally looking like that, he ain't going to do anything. And you would give Joshua a chance. I'm not saying an outright pick, but you would give him a better chance than, say, against someone like Deontay Wilder, who... I know Wilder's only had the one fight, which was against Robert Helenius. He looked good in that fight, but what does that really tell you? I just think from a style matchup, I would be favouring Deontay Wilder. I'll quote Eddie Hearn directly here. He says, "The news changed things. The goal is to become a 3-time heavyweight champion of the world, and that would allow us to do that. The Wilder fight is much bigger, but the Hrgovic fight comes with a world title. That will always take priority." Now, at the end of the day, it is Joshua who makes the final say, so that could be Eddie Hearn saying that's what he wants to do. But with Joshua, if the Wilder fight is there, he's the one who's going to be able to turn around and say, that's the fight I want. So Eddie Hearn is talking about world titles, but what would Joshua be saying? Now, also I'm reading here on Twitter that even if Joshua decides to, say hypothetically, Fury fights Usyk, Fury wins, right? regardless whether Usyk invokes the rematch or not, I would expect Fury to just get rid of the IBF, because he said that several times. And he's always been consistent with that, to be fair. He's always said, no, I'll get rid of the IBF. So let's say he gets rid of that, right? Meaning that it's now vacant. Hrgovic being mandatory would be prime position, and Hrgovic is mandatory, not interim. So mandatory and interim are two different things for those. Some people will say, what's the difference? Interim means basically if Hrgovic was interim IBF champion, if Fury won against Usyk and vacated it, Hrgovic champion. No questions asked, right? Instantly upgraded. Mandatory means that he's not upgraded to champion, he just fights the next contender for the vacant title. Essentially a glorified mandatory, the interim. That's essentially what it is. Now, it's really only to be used if a champion is injured. The WBC, the WBA, they just make it up willy-nilly. You know, it's really strange the way that they use it. Literally, like, they have interim titles. It's always like, you're mandatory, now you're fighting for the interim title, the interim title, and now it's just bizarre. But that's really the only time you should use an interim title, is if the champion is injured. But a lot of them just don't. Now, it says here that Joshua may not actually get a chance to fight Hrgovic for the title, because Otto Valin's win over Murakasiev over the weekend was an IBF eliminator, which it was. It wasn't a final eliminator, but it was an eliminator, which means he'll get a higher ranked. Supposedly, and this is in inverted commas, it is for the number 2 spot with the IBF. Alright? Now, the rankings haven't been updated. They'll probably be updated in the next week or so, but it'd be interesting to see where Otto Wallin comes in those rankings. And bear in mind, right? Bear this in mind. Joshua is number 2, could potentially be number 3, but with Otto Wallin's eliminator, okay, he's only one eliminator. So essentially what they're trying to do is they're trying to find the 2 fighters to fight for the final eliminator. So Otto Wallin is there. You would imagine they're going to order, or at least announce, another fight between 2 available contenders as another eliminator, which would mean that Wallin would fight, hypothetically speaking, let's say they announce Takam versus Bakoli as the second eliminator. That would mean that they would then have to order as another final eliminator, so eliminator on top, a load of big convoluted thing, but they'd essentially be ordering Wallin versus Bakoli, if that was the case, right? So that could push Joshua down further. But with sanctioning bodies, and the IBF are no different than the others. I mean, the WBO and IBF are the better ones. They really don't tend to have as much BS when it comes to, you know, ranking fighters, you know, titles, mandatory stuff like that. They tend to be more, if a rule says this, we're going to abide by it. Whereas the WBC, I mean, they are the worst. They are the absolute worst. The rules are open to interpretation. You know, Sullivan rules it like an absolute monarchy. You know, not a constitutional monarchy, an absolute monarchy where the head just says, this is what the rule says, not anymore, I make the rules. That's literally how Sullivan rules it. The IBF and WBO are a lot more, you know, if a rule says this, we're just going to abide by it. Tough you know what. Don't care if it's Canelo, don't care if it's Fury, don't care if it's Wilder. The rule says this, that's what we're going to do. For the most part anyway. I mean, you do see certain times, you do kind of scratch your head and you think, what the hell was happening there? Like, a good example would be the IBF ranked David Haye back in 2016. I think it was after the Arnold Jajai fight. They had him ranked number 3 or 4, like really high in their ranking. That was the IBF of all people. And Joshua was champion with them at the time. And you were looking at that thinking, what the hell? You know, I think he was ahead of like the likes of Luis Ortiz and people like that. And I know Ortiz, his only big win was against Brian Jennings and people like that, but still better than Damori and Jajai combined. You know, Brian Jennings would probably beat them on the same night. So they do questionable things with rankings and stuff like that, but for the most part they're good. So Eddie Hearn talking about Joshua potentially being in the Deontay Wilder fight, which again, don't sell us a fight or don't say this fight is nailed on, and not only do we not get the fight next, but we might not get the fight at all. You know, don't do that. So he could potentially be fighting Hrgovic. Now, there's a lot of ifs and buts there. There really is, you know. If Joshua is number 2 ranked, and to be honest with you, if Joshua is it, what is the point of having eliminators, right? If Otto Wallin fights Murakasiev and it's an eliminator, and it's to get you a high ranking, to potentially get you into position to fight for the title, and Joshua fights, they were non-title fights as far as I'm aware, Franklin and Hellenius, and it's just kind of like, okay, yeah, you can fight for the vacant title instead. It's like, what's the point in having these eliminators to kind of work this out if you're just going to say, right, well, he's mandatory and we like him. There you go. To me, that just doesn't make sense, and a lot of things in boxing don't make sense. But I would imagine that if the IBF are good like it, that we'll wait and see what the rankings look like. They normally release them in the middle of the month, so I'd say probably next week we'll probably have a look-see and see where they all stand in the lay of the land. That's my thoughts on this. Let me know yours in the comment section below. Oh, and by the way, I don't really know what time to do it tonight, but let's probably say 9 o'clock. I say 9 o'clock because I want to watch the Lion Shadofia Kieran Conway fight. I don't really care about the co-main, and then we're into the main event for Warrington. Live watch along. Have a thumbnail already. I'm looking forward to it. Hope you can join me. I'll chat to you then, people. For now, I'll leave it there. Smash the like button if you could. Subscribe, of course, if you haven't already. Lads, I'll talk to you. Peace.